Welcome to Dungeons & Dragons 101, presented by Nicholas Vidmar and the New Linux Library. We will be discussing what the game is, how to play, and why it has become popular. What it is. Dungeons & Dragons is a tabletop role-playing game. This is a specific genre of game that I'll explain a bit more in the next slide. Following that, we have a social experience, so you're dealing with a group of people. Storytelling medium, it is a cooperative storytelling aspect. Teamwork builder, you are working together, it's a cooperative game. Creative outlet, there are many iterations of how this game can draw from your creative and imaginative side. And a critical thinking exercise. The game has a little more math and problem solving than you think at first glance. We'll talk about that more in the upcoming slides. Tabletop role-playing games. Some of you have probably heard of the term RPG. You've likely heard it referencing something like Mass Effect or Skyrim video games. Those are descendants of Dungeons & Dragons and other tabletop role-playing games, where the style of gaming that you're playing a specific character that levels up over time and sees progress over the course of the game and has narrative benefit is taken from this. So, in those games, you're playing as a specific character. So, Commander Shepard or the Dovahkiin. In Dungeons & Dragons, you invoke a character of your own creation. All of the details of your character are up to you. Their background, what they look like, their skills, their traits, everything. You build them from the ground up, and their story is yours to tell. It is not influenced by the choices laid out in a linear video game. So that also encourages roleplay, where you're acting not as the character's controller, where you're saying, I made my Commander Shepard do X. Instead, it's, I did this, or we did this. There's a separation in video games between you and your avatar, versus in D&D, you are your avatar. You are playing the game as you, but in the mask of your character, a role-playing game, which is where a lot of people have fun with it. You'll see players who are just sitting at the table rolling dice. That's the most common, but you have some that get more into it that will use voices and accents to distinguish themselves from their character. And you have even more that will invest in casual cosplay during the game, where you'll see people come in dressed up, capes, elf ears, all the others. These are all very optional traits, but it's a part of the role play of the game that does make it different and unique to play in. Furthermore, there are many different systems. In this presentation, I will usually be referring to the 5th edition of Dungeons & Dragons, which is the most current and popular iteration of the game. There are hundreds of other systems beyond just D&D. There's Call of Cthulhu, Shadowrun, Edge of the Empire, just to name a few. And they all have different genres too, so you can see sci-fi, you can see fantasy, you can see modern, you can see alternate universe, many beyond that as well. Usually played with 5 people, a DM who runs the game and then 4 other players. As that is the case, cooperative stories abound. It is very common for after a game, moments of the game to become embedded in the group's memory and to be retold as if it was something that happened in real life. The game is also a group effort. While it may be fun to do your own thing, the way that the game is set up and how challenges are thrown at your party, oftentimes it is impossible to succeed on your own. You will need the aid of your other players, so it is an effort of playing nice and figuring out how to make everything work despite differences in the group. So it does also teach a bit of social grace. Teamwork builder. Dungeons & Dragons has many different classes and races. These combinations mean that not all characters have the same abilities. You will not be able to do the same thing as the person who is next to you at the table. As such, your abilities work together oftentimes, as the game accommodates that by throwing problems at you that require coordinated efforts. This reinforces the notion that succeeding alone is next to impossible, because the barbarian won't be able to pick a lock like a rogue will, or any other class-specific ability like that. Also, because of how the game works, and you will start to become attached to your characters, it does create a surprising amount of stress on you, it's good stress, to keep your character alive. As such, you learn to cooperate under pressure because the character that you have poured hours of time into living and continuing to be playable hinges on your ability to work with your teammates. It's a very odd phenomenon that's fairly unique to this game, but it does add a great deal of weight to the game. Creative outlet. Dungeons & Dragons thrives on imagination and creativity. The first aspect of that comes into play is character design. Your character, or PC, player character, is much more than just a bunch of numbers on a character sheet and some dice. Your character has personality, it has an appearance. You get to design that appearance, and you can flesh it out as much as you would like. You can have a very simple character that is simply 5'10", green eyes, flaxen hair, also an elf. Or you can elaborate more so and say, my character stands somewhat tall for an elf at 5'10", long flaxen hair with sharp features, long ears that he was somewhat made fun of as a child. But he wears a dark green leather garment, but it is made of scraps of leather and functions like scale mail where they're all pieced together. Every scrap of leather has been carefully tended to look like a leaf and is gold trimmed. I also wear an amulet that is made of half quartz and half emerald. It is shaped in the form of a tree. I have a set of bracers and a long staff that are styled in the same leaf pattern. You see how that brought my character from being just a generic description to something you can start to envision in your head? Now, some people who are artistically gifted will take that vision and draw it out so everyone can see their character rather than simply be described it. This is like our art for Strix in the middle of the page. Some who are more talented will also get miniatures, which are small pewter or plastic figures, and paint them or modify them if needed to look like their envisioned character. These figures are then used on the tabletop for battle scenarios to accurately measure distances and line of sight and other such things. Neither of these are required for the game, though. Something that is a little more required falls on the GM or Dungeon Master, the one that runs the game. They have to create the world that you're playing in. They create all the countries, they are all the people that the players are not. So there's a lot going on there. Making a world that is an Earth parallel is not that difficult. It still takes time. But you can say, okay, I've got my country Serdio, which is going to be a 16th century Germany parallel. I can draw many things from that culture in real world and use that to inform my fantasy world. Okay, that's reasonable. You can understand how that would be done. It's a little more complicated when you take into effect that Dungeons & Dragons takes place in a fantastical environment. So, I may have 16th century Germany and it fits just fine. I also, 20 miles over, have the gnomish city that is built into giant bioluminescent mushrooms that also function as the food source for the city. Exiled gnomes, or those who are less desirable, are sent to the species of mushrooms that are poisonous so they can no longer eat their homes and have to go find new places to subsist. Not something that has a real world parallel, now is it? Beyond that, you have props, which when you're at a table together, some GMs that are crafty like to actually sculpt or create items for their players to interact with. A common example, making a journal. Say your party is adventuring through a dwarven fortress, abandoned, and you find a notebook. The notebook might be in Dwarvish. The GM could give you that, and then it becomes a puzzle for your players to actually sort out from the physical object they're looking at what it might say and what clues it gives them about the dungeon. In this particular instance, that journal might in fact be the records of a dwarf that tried to reclaim a lost birthright, but died in the process, and this journal will tell the players a safe route to go through the dungeon. Stuff like that. The creativity that this game can draw upon is virtually unlimited. One of the other outlets is if you are not meeting in person, but rather meeting on a virtual tabletop like Roll20. This allows you to have everything on the computer screen and all the processing power of the computers. You won't be using a physical miniature on that, but you have a token that uses character art, which you can find through Pinterest or any other sources of fantasy art. If you're gifted with computers, you can also add stuff like special effects or visual effects, which you can't do on a physical tabletop. There's no effective way on pen and paper to show a fireball being cast, at least, and have it look pretty. In a digital realm, that is a few button clicks away if you know what you're doing. to make every time the player says I cast Fireball, a small explosion to appear on the screen and show you accurately who it hits and what it does. So those are a few options of creativity depending on what your skills and interests are. Critical thinking exercise. Dungeons & Dragons is a constant stream of problems thrown at the players. They have to figure out what their actions will be, what they want to do in the long term, what their plans are. So you do need to be on your feet, kind of thinking about it and having long-term and short-term plans and be able to act quickly because some situations are a little more dire. Puzzles are also commonplace. As I mentioned on the previous slide, you might be given a journal that you have to decode the language for. You also may see this map on the bottom left of our screen, which is a fall away floor. Step on the wrong tile, it drops out from under you and you take some fall damage. So figuring out the right pattern to make through there. An example of the more dire situations and where you need to be rushed to make your decisions. On the right side of the screen, we see a potential description during a game. The floor in front of you collapses into a 10-foot pit as the necromancer at his altar nears the completion of his dire ritual. Skeletons clamber upwards from the depths of the newly formed pit. What do? You've got a necromancer you need to deal with. He's about to raise a lot more zombies. You have a pit at your feet, so you can no longer go straight ahead, and there's skeletons crawling out of it, looking like they're going to attack you. What do you want to do? Do you want to move around the pit? Do you want to try and throw something at the necromancer? Do you want to coordinate with your allies to try and throw one of you over the pit? Does one of you want to drop down to the pit, try and stave off the skeletons while the rest deal with this? These are all potential options that need to be made very quickly as choices. How to play. We'll get a little more into the mechanical meat and the general concept of the game. But one thing that I would like to elaborate on before we start that is, you're at the table, you got a character sheet with some numbers and some dice. That's how you see the game for the most part. Once you actually start playing the game, you'll see on the image on the screen, you've got your dice on the left. Actually playing is the image on the right. Your description isn't, run up, roll my dice, see if I hit. It's what you see on the right. You got a fire giant in front of you, there's lava everywhere, your teammates are on fire. You might be on fire soon. What do you want to do? A lot more weight. Common questions about Dungeons & Dragons. Do I need to wear a cape or dress up? No. Some people choose to, and they have fun at the table. It is a part of the role-play experience, but in no way is it required. Not even voices or acting are required. Just, they add to the game. There's no board. Do I need stuff to play? No. Dungeons & Dragons does not require a board. However, it does require dice, pencil or other writing utensil, but you'll be doing a lot of erasing, so I recommend pencil, paper, and imagination. I have mentioned miniatures and character art and all these other things. Those are optional. You do not require them to play. Dungeons & Dragons, you can start playing for about $10. Can I do whatever I want? Within reason and with reason. You can't suddenly just go AWOL and start trying to become an evil overlord if your character was a lawful good priest, but if something happens and you have a reason, the game does accommodate you to attempt different actions. Doesn't mean you'll succeed. And within reason is amended by the rule that unless you have magic that says otherwise. Generally, unless you have magic that says otherwise, the real world rules apply. The game mimics real life in that regard. So you can't roll to win. Speaking of winning, how do you win? Simple answer, you don't. It is an experience. You win by having fun. Also, not dying helps. You can complete quests within a campaign, or a campaign can be completed. These are also similar to victory conditions, but they are the victory conditions for your game, not for the game. Dungeons & Dragons does not have a written victory condition. The closest would be if you reach level 20 and level out of the game. Creating a character. There are several steps to building a character for Dungeons & Dragons. You'll need inspiration, to pick a race, to pick a class, and to pick a background. Each of these steps we'll go over in a little more detail. Inspiration. You'll need something to inspire and pull your character from. There are two fairly common routes of how to do this. Do you have a favorite character? Why are they your favorite character? What about them do you like? What traits would you want to try and mimic in your D&D character? Or, if you lived in a world of magic and fantasy, what role would you want to play? This can be ideas of what do you as an actual person lack and you'd want to have in a fantasy world. If you're the weak nerd, you can play the super strong barbarian. A lot of people do have characters built like that. Or you can be the valiant knight, the princess who's actually not a damsel, the crazy old hermit harboring a dark secret. These are all valid roles that you could build a character upon. You can also look at pop culture. Going around the characters we have on the slide, we've got Doctor Strange. He's a human sorcerer. Bruce Lee, monk. Captain Jack is a rogue. Jon Snow, fighter. We've got Morrigan, who is a warlock. Bilbo Baggins, also a rogue. David Bowie is a bard. Conan the Barbarian is, surprise, a barbarian. Poison Ivy is a druid. Dumbledore, wizard. Aragorn is a ranger. And Captain America is a paladin. These are all the core classes of Dungeons & Dragons. Race. You'll pick your race or your species for your character, and there are numerous races, each with their own flavor and benefit. You've got the core races. These are the most common, the ones that you'll see on an everyday basis in the D&D societies. Dwarf, short, stout, strong as the stone they mine. Elves, many sub-races and varieties, but they tend to be haughty, slightly less well-built than humans, and usually magically gifted. Gnomes. They are much shorter and much more frenetic. They constantly move around and are curious. Make good inventors, and they do have a few sub-races. Very colorful. Half-elf. Usually a human-elf hybrid. They get the best of both worlds, but they're liked by neither. They are some of the best talkers in the game. Halflings. Hobbits from Lord of the Rings. Short folk, very lucky, and a little bit clever. Half-orc, big bruiser. You want to cause damage? This is the race for you. Humans, everyone's second best friend. They're not great at any one thing, but they're good at a lot of things. Then, we have the uncommon races. These are the ones that you need to find enclaves of. They're much less common across the world, but they're still open to players if you want to deal with their complexities. You've got the Aarakocra, which are bird-like humanoids. They come from the elemental plane of air, and they are very strange to the prime material or earth. Aasimar. These are celestial-blooded humans. They have angelic blood, and some of that ability manifests with them. Dragonborn. They are humanoid small dragons. They have a breath weapon, and they are very tribal. Furbolgs. These are small nature giants with the ability to turn invisible, and they are almost natural-born druids. Genasi. These are like the Aasimar, but instead of angels, they are descended from the elements: earth, fire, water, and air. Goliath. Proper half-giants. Kenku. Kenku are small, raven-like humanoids that do not have the ability to speak. They are particularly good thieves and miscreants. Tabaxi. They are catfolk, very curious, and as a race they go ooh shiny and are easily distracted. Tiefling. The opposite to Aasimar. They are fiend or devil-blooded humanoids. Though, depending on what version of D&D you're playing, it's either they are properly descended from fiends, or someone in their family made a pact with the devil and their bloodline was the cost. So they do not have any actual fiend blood, they are simply cursed. And then Triton. Triton are the Atlanteans. They are an aquatic race that defend the oceans. They are very stoic people. Class. This is your character's occupation. It's what they've learned, their skill sets, what they're good at. It also provides the meat of mechanical gameplay. Most of your abilities are derived from your class, so it tells you what you can do in the game. and there are a fair few, which we'll go over. And into the classes we go. We have the Barbarian. It is a berserker utilizing primal rage to shrug off damage. They are great at dealing damage, and they take it just as well. They are the tanks, they'll keep the party alive, but they are a little less civilized, typically. The Fighter. It's your all-around soldier. They are frontline combatants like the Barbarian, but they're more tactical. They have more abilities instead of simple damage amplification. Monk. It's your fast acrobatic melee combatants. Don't think Christian monk like the friars, think martial arts kung fu movies. Paladin. Holy warrior. It's the knight in shining armor, except for instead of simply relying on armor, which is the fighter, they call upon the wrath of gods to amplify their strikes and do much more damage to those who are evil. Ranger. It's a hunter that specializes in working with nature. Their name implies it, but it's not necessary to use a ranged weapon. They have many specialized skills, and they are similar to a hybrid of the fighter and the druid. The rogue. It's a stealthy figure with much utility, able to sneak around, get damage on precision strikes, and has a lot of utility and skills. The bard. Magical musician. Very good at a variety of things, knows many skills like the rogue does, and has quite a few abilities to help bolster the team. The cleric, a warrior priest. Comparable to the paladin, except for the paladin is about getting into the fray of combat, while the cleric is the spellcaster, using divine magics to heal their allies, help them, and to harm the enemy and make it more difficult for them to act. A very versatile class. The druid is similar to the cleric, but instead of divine energies, they use nature magics. They have many abilities to shapeshift and to summon animals and others to aid them, and they have a wide array of spells like the cleric. The sorcerer. It's a caster with a well of malleable internal power. Unlike the cleric who draws their power from the gods, the druid who draws from nature, or the wizard who gains it through study, the sorcerer has magic within them, either from a magical parent or somewhere else down the lineage, or they were simply exposed to a great amount of magic and it stuck with them. This allows them to shape magic to their will. They're less broad than the other casters. They know a smaller well of spells, but they can do more with the spells they know than any other class can. The warlock. The warlock is a mage who made a deal with a great power for forbidden knowledge. Unlike the cleric who draws their power from their faith in the god, a warlock made a deal with an eldritch being, Cthulhu, a fiend, for dark powers, or an archfey, which is not as dark. And they get to break some rules of magic because they are not learning in the standard way. Similar to the sorcerer in that regard. But they have a much smaller spell list than the other classes. But they do get to treat the spells they have very differently. Arguably, the warlock is the most complicated caster because it functions so differently from any of the others. And lastly, the wizard. Your typical academic mage. They've learned through study, and they know the widest breadth of spells. They have specializations in certain schools, and they are unfortunately the most physically weak class. So you really want to stay out of combat with them unless you are very competent at defensive magic. Background. This is what makes your character more than a stat block. Your race and class contributes your numbers. Your background is purely for roleplay. It adds the experience of your character before they decide to become an adventurer. It informs how you're going to react to different situations. So a character who was a soldier might be more militaristic in how they approach things. There's a regimented process. There's a way to do things. A sailor might be a little more loose and be more comfortable when they're on the docks than anywhere else in the city. This kind of just informs how you will be playing. And there are several established examples of backgrounds, but you can also feel free to make your own. The archetypes do help a little bit more. So some of the established backgrounds are soldier, sailor, sage, hermit, outlander, acolyte, or folk hero. Each of these gives you a little benefit of the people you know. soldier, you can pull rank. A sailor can get free passes on ships. A sage knows where to look for information. A hermit is good at finding things in the wild and living alone. The outlander is much the same, but they are also good at traveling. The acolyte can establish free stays with allied temples, and the folk hero can leverage their legend to get free stays at inns. Stuff like that. And there's more, but this is just a small sampling of what you can do. Learning the tools and terms. Dungeons & Dragons and other TTRPGs use many different forms of dice and other terms. The core dice that you will use is the D20, or the 20-sided die. In our image of the blue dice, that is the one on the left side. The other common dice you will see are the D4, which is the triangle-shaped dice in the bottom right of that image. And the terminology is D, it stands for dice, and then the number is how many sides it has. So you may hear it referenced as roll 2d4, in which case you're rolling 2 4-sided die. D6, 6-sided die. D8, 8-sided die. 10, 10-sided. 12, 12-sided. And then D100 gets a little more interesting, in that there are two common manifestations of the die. You either have the image at the very bottom of the large golf ball black-looking die, which is a 100-sided die, or you can roll percentile die, which are the two D10s at the top of the blue dice image, the one with single numbers and the other with 2 digits. You roll those together to get a combination number. So 000 is 100, and 001 is 1, otherwise you combine them between as the numbers read. The most common dice to be used are the D20, and roughly 2/3 of all die rolls made in the game are probably going to be with the D20. All the other dice are used for damage, and that will be based on what class you're using. Casters tend to use a lot of D6s and a lot of D8s. Barbarians are the only ones to use D12. So what class you play will affect what dice you are using. In terms of terms, we have skill check, which is an ability trying to accomplish something. For example, to see what you know about a creature, or about a history, or trying to push something, lift something. These are skill checks. They are made using a D20 and comparing with your character's abilities. A saving throw is a defensive roll that your character will make when something bad is about to happen to them beyond a standard attack. So if you're trying to dodge out of the way of falling rocks or trying to mitigate the effects of a poison, these will be saving throws. Proficiencies are what your character is trained in, what they've studied and gotten good at. So, for example, a barbarian, as a physical fighter, is much better at pushing and jumping, so athletics and acrobatics, and so they have proficiency in those skills, meaning that they have additional numbers they add to their die roll beyond just their ability score. Initiative is how quick you are to react in combat. It determines the order in which players act during a combat sequence. Crit or critical is when you roll a natural 1 or a natural 20, natural meaning it's the number that shows up on the die, on a D20 roll. This is obviously the best and the worst that you can do. In combat, these have additional effects. In skill checks, they are simply the best or worst you did, not a guaranteed failure or success. AC, or armor class, is how tough it is to inflict a blow on the target or your character. It's the number that you're trying to meet. So if you roll to hit your D20 plus your appropriate modifiers, and the number you get is equal to your target's AC or higher, you will hit them and do damage. DC is like AC, but it stands for difficulty class and is for saving throws or other non-combat related skills. HP, or hit points or health points, are how tough your character are, how many hits they can take before they go unconscious and start dying. And then ability scores and attributes. These are the core numbers that make up your character. You'll have 6 of them. There is strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. These numbers, once you have them fill out, expand and fill out the rest of your character sheet for the most part in terms of the numerical scores. They are what determine your skill checks, your saving throws, part of your AC, and part of your DC. So, very important, and they are the core aspect of building a character. Mechanics. Here we will be discussing the basics of how you play, what dice you roll, when, and others. So, the primary tool of Dungeons & Dragons is the D20, or 20-sided die, which I showed you in the last slide. Most actions in the game require a D20 roll, in which case you'll roll the D20 and add your called for modifiers. The DM will tell you what type of roll you're making, an ability check, a saving throw, whatever it may be. They all follow this formula. So let us say you are making a strength athletics check to try and push a boulder out of the way of a door. You'll roll your d20, add your athletics trait, which should include your strength modifier and your proficiency bonus. Altogether, let's say you rolled a 13 and you have a +4, you rolled a 17 total. The DM will have a DC or difficulty class in mind, and in this case it would probably be a 15, which you beat the DC and therefore your action is successful. These modifiers are your strength athletics. As I said, they come from proficiency and your ability score. And in some cases, if you have a particular benefit to the situation, like you have a pry bar or crowbar to move the boulder, you'll have advantage, meaning you roll your d20 twice and take the better roll. Or disadvantage, it's slippery out, you don't have good traction. You'll have disadvantage, meaning you roll the 2 dice and take the lower result, and factor in against the DC and all that. Combat uses a very similar formula. To hit, it's almost identical to this. It uses your weapon proficiency plus your strength or dex mod. But damage, once you hit your target, will use a different die than the d20, but will still roll the die and add any applicable modifiers like strength or spell proficiencies, if you have anything like that. Some other features of the mechanics are criticals. In combat, if you roll a natural 1 or a natural 20 on a d20, it matters more. A natural 1, meaning it's the number that shows up on the die, is an automatic miss, no matter what your modifiers are. So even if you have a ridiculously plus or high plus, it will still miss the target. A 20 always hits, no matter how badly you would miss with your modifiers. A natural 20 will also double the damage that you do. It's a lucky strike, essentially. Movement. Most races default to 30 feet of movement if you're playing on a grid that is typically 5 feet per square, so you can move 6 squares. Some races have a speed of 25, some have a speed of 35, and then some classes further your speed beyond that. But the default is 30. Some more miscellaneous rulings that you probably will need to know. If you're playing a spellcaster, you'll have to worry about spell slots. This is the amount of magical acumen that you possess. Spells are divided into a couple tiers. There are 1st through 9th level spells and cantrips. Cantrips are very simple magics that you can cast any number of times per day. Spells beyond that are slotted spells, and slotted spells are limited. Most casters will have X slots per level, so you may have 3 first level spell slots, 2 second level spell slots, and 1 third level spell slot. More advanced magics use different spell slots, so we'll use the spell Fireball. Fireball is a 3rd level spell. It has a fairly large effect. You can only cast it using spell slots of 3rd or higher level. And this is what makes spellcasting a little more complicated, because you do have these additional resources to keep track of and what spells can be cast where. There's also upcasting. Certain spells gain additional effects if they're cast at a higher level than they are. And one of the other features you'll need to know is dying. If your character ever reaches 0 or less HP, they are dying. A dying character will need to make death saves. A death save is a flat d20 roll. A 10 or better is a save. 1 through 9 is a fail. If you save and you get 3 saves, you stabilize and are at 0 HP and no longer dying. If you get 3 fails, you're dead. Perma dead. The additions to that are if you roll a natural 20, you receive 2 pluses to your saves, and if that brings you to 3 instead of stabilizing at 0, you pop up at 1 hit point and are able to rejoin the fray. If you roll a natural 1, on the other hand, it is 2 failed saves, and if that brings you to 3, you're dead as you would normally be. One of the other ways that you can die is through something called massive damage. If your character in a single attack takes more than double their total hit points in the negative, they instantly die. So say you're at 2 hit points and you have a maximum of 15 hit points. An attack does 33 damage to you. That would drop you the 2 hit points to 0, and then you still have 31 hit points of damage. Your hit point is maximum is 15, doubled is 30, so that does bring you over your hit point maximum, and therefore your character would instantly die from massive damage. At higher levels, there are also insta-kill effects like Disintegrate, which is if that spell brings your character to 0 hit points, they turn to a pile of ash and are dead. But those are rarer than dying of the simple 3 fails. If you take damage while dying, you also automatically lose a death saving throw. And here we have the character sheet for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. You will see there are several colored boxes which highlight some of the more important parts of the sheet. The sheet will contain all of the mechanical information for your character. It is not uncommon to have additional sheets that cover spellcasting or additional information. Furthermore, some players opt to have a character journal where they will keep notes about the character's adventures in their campaign and people or NPCs that they know. To go over the sheets, we can see the first box is our red box on the left side. This is encompassing your ability scores. The ability scores are the numbers that fill out the rest of your character sheet. To generate these, the most traditional way is to roll 4d6 and subtract the lowest. This gives you an ability score between 3 and 18 that you can assign to any of those boxes, and you repeat until all your boxes are full. To then get your modifier from the ability score, you subtract 10 from your score and divide by 2. So a 16 becomes a 3, and that is your modifier. You'll use that modifier in your skill section, which is in yellow, or orange, whatever you prefer to call that color. Above that box is the saving throws in bright green. Again, you'll be using the modifier from your abilities for the assigned skill. Above the green box, we have our proficiency bonus. Proficiency bonus will be added along with your ability modifier to the skills that you are trained in. To the right, we have the purple box. This encompasses 3 stats: your armor class, your initiative, and your speed. Your armor class is a combination of what armor you're wearing and your natural ability to dodge, to factor how hard it is to hit you. This is typically determined by 10 plus your dexterity modifier plus any armor bonuses from equipment that you have. Your initiative is your dexterity modifier, and it is what is used to determine where you go in combat. And your speed is how quickly your character can move on a board. I mentioned before, most races default to 30 feet. This is where you keep track of your specific character's speed, which may fluctuate during a game because of equipment, spells, etc. Beneath the purple box, we have your hit points. This is the number of hit points that you have total and what your current amount is. Below that box, we have our death saving throws, which you'll fill out if you ever get into the dying situation. Dying resets when you come back to conscious. In the blue box beneath that are your attacks and spells. These are the actions that you can take in combat. Usually you'll have your weapon type, so long sword, your 2-hit modifier, which if you're trained with the weapon is your proficiency bonus, plus strength, and then your damage roll, which for a longsword is 1d8 or 1d10, depending on if you're wielding it one-handed or two-handed. and then you'll add strength to that damage die, so it's 1d8 plus strength for one-handed, and a longsword does slashing damage. So all that information will be noted on each of those lines, and you'll do that for each weapon that you have and each damaging spell that you have. The dark green box to the right of our blue box is where you list your features and traits. These are additional skills that your class gives you, like the Barbarian's Rage or the Fighter's Second Wind. Other notes is beneath the blue box is the Equipment tab. This is where you'll include any money that your character earns or any equipment that is not a weapon, per se. To the left of that are your proficiencies and languages, what tools and weapons you're trained in, and what languages you know. At the top of the page, you'll have your character's name and their demographic information, essentially. What race and class they are, who the player is, alignment. Alignment is their general moral bent. Do they value the good of the people? Do they value their own self-righteousness? Are they Robin Hood? Steal from the rich, give to the poor. A little chaotic, but also serving the greater good. That is your alignments. Many GMs choose to ignore alignments, and how your character acts decides it. That is the character sheet in a nutshell, but you will also see on the upper right there are your bonds, ideals, and flaws. These are to help inform your roleplay. What is your character attached to? What is influencing their actions? You can make notes of that here. Moving to the ebb and flow of the game, how it runs at the table. The game runs in a cycle. The cycle in its most basic form is narration, reaction, roll, narration. What that means is the DM, or Dungeon Master, will narrate the scenario that the players find themselves in. If we look at the image on the right, we see a very humorous but basic form of this. You're lost in a forest with no roads. What do you do? The question is posed to the players. They have a moment to think on what they would like to do. The players react by saying, "I will locate one of the natives and ask for assistance." The DM considers this and figures out what skills would be used in trying to find another creature in the woods that might know enough to be able to help them. That would be a survival check, so the DM asks the players to make a survival check. The lead of the group rolls, and as we can see in the image, they roll a natural 1, the worst they could do. The DM opts to give them something instead of saying you find no one. In this particular instance, the return is you find a strange creature with long ear flaps that looks vaguely amphibious. As you turn around, its short eye stalks turn a little before its head. It looks at you and says, "Misa Jar Jar Binks, who are you?" And you struggle to interact with the creature. What do you wish to try and do? And the cycle begins again, as the players are now once more posed a question. They found a creature, they need to figure out how they're going to interact with it to get along. So the game runs in that cycle in pretty much every scenario. Combat runs in a similar way, narratives run in a similar way, but it can go between finding a local native, to trying to stealth through a castle, to figuring out how they want to rappel down a walking construct. They all have a very similar ebb and flow. The game also relies on the concept of yes and, which is, some of you may recognize, an improv tactic. The idea of yes and is that you take whatever the other person who's interacting with you has given you, no matter how ridiculous it may be, and build off of it instead of trying to tear it down. Someone may say that their background includes them in a thieves guild. You don't say, "You can't have been in Thieves Guild, I was in Thieves Guild." Because it's the idea of yes and. The DM, on the other hand, can supersede this rule, as they do have end say in the world. But in general, you want to try and build on what other players say instead of tearing them down. So yes, and I do X because of what you said Y. So that idea does hold true in most games, especially if you are roleplay heavy in the games. Imagination and creativity. D&D is one of the few activities that encourages imagination. The game doesn't present everything to you. You need to actually visualize it, see what's happening, put critical thinking to add details that the GM simply cannot provide, and keep the game moving. That being said, the adventure takes place in your mind. It is your world as you create it. The details may be different for every single person at the table, which is part of what makes the game fascinating, is that you'll all remember the same event differently. And part of that is well envisioned in the image to the right. If only people could see with more than just their eyes. That group of kids, yeah, they're at a table looking like a bunch of nerds. In their minds, though, they see the above. And that's part of the draw of the game. But to help demonstrate this difference in detail in your minds, I'm going to describe a scenario from a game, or an environment more specifically. I want you to go along as I'm describing it, think in your head, imagine what it looks like. And then we'll have a little comparison afterwards. So, you and your group is approaching an area known as Shirley's Temple. You climb up an arduous mountain for 2 days before arriving there. As you approach, the sound of tinkling water reaches your ears, and the sun is high in the sky. As you approach, the worn mountain path turns into a cobbled, if aged, road. As you approach, you see that there is a bridge made of white marble with arches going across. As it does, it turns and leads onto the main plateau of the temple. Stepping across, you see that at the far end of this plateau, there is an archway that leads into the temple proper. The archway has a dragon emblazoned above the top, etched in. A gem stands out as the eye, and it glows faintly when you approach. As you pass through the tunnel, it leads you into a hall. Lining the hall are statues on either side, posed and waiting for someone to walk through. The floor shows signs of age. Portions of it have been damaged by time and growth. On the right side, you see that a wall has fallen through, and you can see the temple rise above you as it lets a stream of sunlight in, caressing the ground. On the left, you see there is a doorway that leads out onto a patio of sorts. Beyond that, past the final array of statues and the colonnades, you see a flight of stairs that leads up to an altar. Beyond the altar, you see open sky, and a staircase ascending further into the temple. Alright, think about it, envision everything in your head. Now I've got a few questions for you, and compare it. When we walk up, what did the dragon look like? Describe in your mind. What did the statue look like? What art style was it etched in? What gem was the eye? Got it? Alright. Now, what I envision is a highly stylized line art drawing. It's simple. It looks almost more like a peacock than a dragon, with long flowing lines to enumerate tails and the wings. The head stretches out in a long neck, and a bright white quartz gem is the eye. And it glows a bright white light when you get close to it. Not a beam, simply an aura of light. The tunnel you pass through, is it dark? Is it brightly lit? Are there smooth stones lining the floor? Mine, it is a dark, roughly 20-foot tunnel. The stone is actually painted black. It's not simply that it is dark here. And it emphasizes the light when you pass into the next hall. In the hall, the statues. What were they of? Are they warriors? Are they poets? Are they posed for battle? Do they have weapons? Are the weapons made of stone? Or are they actual weapons that can be taken out of their hands? What material are the statues made out of? Is it white marble like the temple? Is it sandstone? Is it dark granite? In my mind, the statues are sandstone of warriors in heroic poses, much like Greek statues, but they are made of sandstone that has worn away with time, so the features are eroded. Faceless soldiers. They do have stone weapons. Continuing on. What type of growth is in the temple? Is it pristine? Is it overgrown with ivy or bushes? Or were there vines hanging from the ceiling? as the vines are what are in my mind. Lastly, moving up the stairs. What type of altar awaits you? Is it highly decorated? Is it a simple stone slab? Does it have a strange arch to it? Is it circular? Is it rectangular? What is on the altar? Is it empty? Is there a chalice above it or a body? What type of altar is this serving? In my mind, it is a large sandstone altar of post-lintel design with thick slabs. It is empty, except for a small rune that sits in the top engraved in, but you would not be able to see that from where you were looking during the description. Do you understand how hugely different your imaging of the temple was from mine, based on the fairly detailed description that I gave the first time through? Makes sense why your imagination fills in the details. This is also a fantastic lesson for those of you who didn't think you had much imagination. Was your temple exactly the same as mine? If it wasn't, that's you using your imagination. And that is how this game works. It trains your imagination. Now, some of you may be asking where to play, especially in the midst of this quarantine. In better times, some of the more common places to play were at FLGS or your friendly local game store. If you can find one, it's a great place to get a jumping off point, to find a group, or to play Adventurers League, which is much more beginner friendly. In the lieu that you either are experienced or want to try in a more private environment, playing at friends is the most traditional way of doing so. Sit in the basement with a group of 4 or 5, Mountain Dew and Doritos, gamer fuel. But some of us prefer healthier snacks, not obligated. Virtually is the most viable in the current situation, and I'll have a few slides dedicated to explaining how to go about that process. Or Play by Post, which is a text-based game. You can play D&D through text, just acting as your characters in dedicated chat. This is the least commitment involved in a game, as you don't have to organize everyone's schedules to meet together for 2 to 4 hours, either online or in person. In this time of quarantine, the easiest place to meet for D&D is on a virtual tabletop. The one I would recommend because it is free is Roll20. Some of the pros of the Roll20 website and virtual tabletop is that it is indeed free, it's highly customizable, and it supports most systems. On the flip side, if you want to get good at using the system and use the advanced features that online enables you to, there is a steep learning curve. And especially now because there are quite a few people who are using the website, much more so than it was designed for, it has slowed down a fair bit. And that many of the roles and such are manual. You'll need to type in for what you want to do, instead of having a single click. This is all in the free aspect. You can buy modules for the system, and that makes it more simple to roll as it becomes one click, as there's an integrated compendium. There are other options beyond Roll20 for virtual tabletops, but most of them have a subscription fee or are not as supportive of different systems. I would recommend looking around and exploring. Roll20 is proven to be one of the easier to get into for cheap, but if you're willing to put out a little more, there are better systems like Fantasy Grounds. But it's each to their own. I personally prefer Roll20, having used Fantasy Grounds. To begin using Roll20, there are a few steps. First, you'll need to create an account with them. The sign-up is free, and it's your basic contact info. Once you do, and you're going to be the game master, the one creating the game, you will have to go to the Create a Game option on the front page of the site. From there, you'll have to select what system you want to play. If you're choosing to play 5th edition, what we've talked about here, you'll select D&D 5th edition. Then you'll have to select character sheet. Some systems will auto-select their matching sheet, but otherwise you'll want to pick the character sheet created by Roll20. Then you can select a module. This is optional. A module is a pre-written adventure, and on Roll20 they often have their maps and tokens filled out, so you have much less prep work to do and everything's kind of set up for you. They often include pre-generated characters as well, so you don't have to go through the process of creating a character for every person. You can simply assign them a character from the pre-generated list. For beginners, I would recommend this course. but you can also create a second game just to mess around and learn the features of Roll20 a little bit first. To that end, there are many online tutorials on YouTube that I would recommend looking up just to get a better grasp on the site's many features. If you opt to select a module, that's good. If not, you can simply go directly to Launch Game. This will take you to the virtual tabletop. Once on the tabletop, you will see a blank gridded screen and a sidebar. The sidebar is where most of your tools are. To create a character, when you look at the sidebar, you'll see there are several tabs at the top. You will want to go to the one that looks like a folded magazine. It also is labeled Journal. Under Journal, you can click the plus button and add characters, handouts, folders, etc. When you add a character, it will create a new character sheet that you can rename and assign to a player by adding it to their journal and adding to who can control it under the Edit button. Once you do that, that player, when they log into Roll20 and your game, will be able to edit that sheet on their own. To add a player to a game, you'll see there is an invite link on the front page of the game before you log into the tabletop, or in the tabletop, you'll see that at the top of the chat menu, there is a blacked out bar that when you hover over it provides a shareable link which you can send to players via any messaging application, and that will directly link them to the game. Once you have your characters and players, you will need to create tokens for them on the tabletop. Roll20 does have a selection of tokens freely available, or you can also upload any image to use as a token. If you want to be a little fancier, you can make a nice circular token through rolladvantage.com and their token stamp, which you will then just upload that token. After you've created your tokens, you have the basics of what you need to run a game. A tabletop, a character sheet, and some tokens for those character sheets to know where they are. Roll20 has a toolbar on the left side of the screen as well that lets you select your token, move them about, pan the screen, measure on the tabletop, and several other features. One of the later features is the ability to roll dice. You'll click on what looks like a 20-sided die, and that will pop out a menu that lets you select how many dice you are rolling. Once you click them, the rolls will pop up in the chat menu. And that is the very, very basics of what you'll need to be able to play. I would still recommend looking at the online tutorials, as Roll20 is a steep learning curve still. Experiment before playing. It doesn't take too long to get a grasp of what you can basically do, but I would recommend doing so before you try and run a game, or have one person who's been on the game before. But once you start rolling dice, it learns pretty quickly. One of the other options, if you want to play 5th edition, is you can look up his website called D&D Beyond, which has a much simpler character creator, and does have the basic rules included for free, but you will need to buy anything else beyond that. Still, a useful tool to get a handle on what you are trying to learn. And now just to go over in review what we've covered here, and to summarize what we need to. What you need for a game of Dungeons & Dragons. You'll need dice, pencil, paper, basic rules, and imagination. Most of those you can get for free. The pencil, paper, and basic rules are online at wizardsofthecoast.com or through D&D Beyond, as I mentioned in the previous slide. Imagination you have to provide for yourself, and dice you can acquire through many online stores. There are also several free online dice rollers or phone applications. D&D is a cooperative game. You are working together, and that is part of the mindset you should walk in with, is that you're not trying to screw over your other players or win the game. To create a character, you'll need to select a race, a class, and a background. Combined with your ability scores, they give you your character. Most of the game falls under the formula of 1d20 plus modifiers. The DM will tell you what modifiers you are using. Combat replaces the d20 with your damage die. The game is broken down into a set ebb and flow or cycle of narrate, player's reaction, called for rolls, and DM's narration of results, which cycles back into the first narrate. And lastly, where you can play. Local game stores is a good place to find a group or learn the basics of the game from experienced players. A friend's house gives you more privacy, and you can mess around a little more and figure things out. Or online on a virtual tabletop like Roll20, which lets you meet remotely, but still gives you most of the features of an in-person game, with slightly less interaction. Lastly is a play-by-post through an online chat, like Discord or Facebook chat, where you get to type out everything, but still have a roleplay experience. There are many online tutorials that will explain D&D more. If this has piqued your interest and you want some rule sets, I would recommend the basic rules from wizardsofthecoast.com to give you a little jump on the game, especially if you want to run the game. And they also have pre-generated characters if the character sheet is daunting to you. I wish you luck, and may the dice favor you.